On today's episode of PolicyWise.
In 2018, the CDC reported that 26%, or 1 in 4, of adults in the United States have some type of disability.
The way I was treated with my 504 plan and getting accommodations, other disability rights issues, I personally did not have the best experience.
In 2019, the US Census found that over 3 million children in the United States had a disability since 2008.
Something terrible is happening. I'm going to die of BDs. And then I had a doctor explain what it was. And I was like, oh, okay. Kids didn't get it. And so all they knew was it's a sickness. A lot of kids would be like, don't touch her. She'll give it to you. And I was like, it's not the cheese touch. I can't give you my bad pancreas. That's not how it works. A lot of 7-year-olds don't get that.
With the highest rate of childhood disability belonging to the American Indian and Alaska Native communities, followed by children of more than one race and Black children.
Today we will be discussing the experience of those with disabilities and disability rights in California.
Especially when you're little and to other kids, the idea of anything that seems other gets defined as bad pretty often.
And people were like, you're so lucky that you get ADHD medication and you can just focus anytime you want. And I'm like, it's not a recreational drug to me. It's like a therapeutic device.
From this conversation, we hope to illuminate the challenges as well as policy plans to tackle systematic barriers to those with disabilities.
I think a teacher without training has the ability to do so much harm. Like if a student comes to them saying that they're dealing with depression or anxiety and the teacher says, oh, you're strong, you can get over it. Instead of a referral to actual services.
But more on that later. Welcome to PolicyWise, a Youth Leadership Institute podcast. I'm your host, Ellie Arzbaecher.
And I'm your other host, Michael Wiafe. With us, we have a few guests. The first one is Zofia Trexler. Zofia, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Zofia Trexler. Pronouns are she, her. I currently work for Disability Rights California as a peer self-advocacy trainer. And also am on the Transitional Age Youth Advocacy Board for Mental Health America of California. And I'm a student at Fresno City College.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us.
We also have with us a very special guest, my sister, Natalia. Natalia, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes. Hello. I'm Natalia Arzbaecher. My pronouns are she, her. I am a freshman at UC San Diego. And I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I've had type 1 diabetes for the past 11 years.
It's great to have you both with us. We're really excited for this episode. Starting with you, Zofia, why do you think this is an important issue for you?
I myself have disabilities. I had a 504 plan in high school, and my job is a peer self-advocacy trainer, so I work as a peer to transitional age youth who have psychiatric disabilities, which is what I have. So yeah, just the way I was treated with my 504 plan and everything, and getting accommodations and just other disability rights issues, I personally did not have the best experience. And obviously the goal is to make sure that no one else has those experiences as well. So that's why it's an important issue to me.
Absolutely. And I know, Natalia, you have gone through some of the same experiences. So why is this an important issue for you?
Well, there's always that saying, the personal is political. So the idea of experiencing disability myself, having to deal with that basically most of my life, and having also experiences with 504 plans and trying to get accommodations and everything that goes along with that. And then also just seeing a reflection of how healthcare is really inaccessible for a lot of people, and being able to witness how my the fact that I'm privileged and where I was brought up and everything, that I had access to things that allowed my medical journey to be a lot easier than it is for a lot of people. So just being aware of how difficult healthcare and having access to things like insulin, which make my life possible, is very difficult for a lot of people.
I would just love to clarify for the listeners, what is a 504 plan?
So it's under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. It basically gives you accommodations in a school setting. It's only in K through 12. It's different than IEP, which is an individualized educational plan, which can be more intensive. It's just different. It's just two different ways of having accommodations in the learning environment. But yeah, it gives you accommodations in a school setting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Natalia, you mentioned that you've had diabetes for 11 years. You were diagnosed at the age of 7, so quite young. I remember some stories from when we were in elementary school about some of the things other kids would say and just generally some of the stuff around being a young person with a disability in that setting. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like being diagnosed at such a young age and kind of the stigma that you experienced and the conversation you experienced from kids your age when you were in elementary school?
I was diagnosed really young, so I didn't understand the depth of what it meant to have like a disability. Like a lot of the stigma, big stigma around it that I think is unintentional. That I think it's like the idea of like things being like good intentions is that no adults in my life really ever like sat me down to be like, this is a chronic illness, this is disability. I think it was just assumed that I understood what that meant. Instead, it was sort of just like, this is what you have. And so the idea of like trying to alleviate like you don't want to address it, it's sort of like the elephant in the room because they think that it makes it easier if you don't know, I guess. And so like I know that when I got diagnosed, funny story is I didn't know what diabetes was, and so when I heard it I thought it was die of beaties, and I was terrified. I thought I was going to die because no one wanted to explain it to me, and I was like in the hospital and my mom was crying, and I was like, my mom never cries, oh my god. Something terrible is happening, I'm going to die of beaties. And then I had a doctor explain what it was, and I was like, oh, okay, this is not as bad as I thought it was. But yeah, it was definitely weird going back to school and that transition of trying to explain it to people. Of like, kids didn't get it, and so like all they knew was like it's a sickness, and we have this idea of what like sickness is and disease is, and it's so I had a lot of people thinking that they could catch it from me. So I remember being like very isolated, like especially the first couple of years I was diagnosed, because there was like a lot of kids that would be like, "Don't touch her, she'll give it to you," and I was like, "It's not the cheese touch. I can't give you my bad pancreas. That's not how it works." Um, yeah, unfortunately I can't touch you and boom, your beta cells stop working. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but a lot of 7-year-olds don't get that. So it was a lot of explaining myself to people for a really long time, like especially when you're little, and to other kids being like, that's not how it works. And obviously kids are a little bit ruthless. They don't really know, they don't get it. I think that's probably the biggest thing that comes from any disability, is that idea of like othering that happens, especially so young, because kids just, I think, don't understand when people are different. Like it's such a huge issue of like trying to expose kids to it, but the idea of anything that seems other gets defined as bad pretty often. And so that was definitely the biggest challenge I had to deal with, is just trying to get people to understand that like my disability does in fact make me a little bit different. It changes the way that I interact with the world to an extent, but it doesn't mean that it's like I'm somehow less of a person or something, or like less than, in a way, if that makes any sense.
Do you think a solution to the challenge that you're kind of describing for us would be solved by maybe teaching all children what a disability is and what that means for your classmates? Do you think all students would need to learn that, or maybe would it be only in classrooms where a student is diagnosed with something?
I think everyone should learn it, because I think that the issue is that sometimes it's really hard to like reach people after it's kind of like not, it's to do something post someone getting diagnosed or someone having a disability. It's sort of not effectively solving the issue, because then you're doing it after it's already become a problem. I think being preemptive and sort of teaching everyone, because at some point in your life you're going to come across somebody that has some form of disability, whether it's super visible, super apparent, very has a direct effect on their being able-bodied, or if it's more, I'm sort of more of like an invisible disability category where it's not very apparent if you look at me, because I'm still able to very much like coherently communicate and use my body for the most part. So the idea of like trying to like nip it in the bud, of explaining that like not everyone's going to have the same body as you, not everyone's going to exist the same as you, everyone has different problems. And the idea of like trying to how kids understand that like it's not something that's wrong or like dirty, because I think a huge issue with it is that kids just don't get it, and I didn't get it for a really long time. Like I didn't have anyone sit me down to tell me that I had a chronic illness until I was 15. It took 8 years of being diagnosed before someone looked at me directly to tell me it was like a chronic illness, which is crazy considering that I'd been like dealing with it for 8 years. So I was like 7 years old. That's a really long time to like not ever like address it as it fully is. And I think the idea of like walking on eggshells doesn't really help anyone in the long term. Like I know that there's this idea of protecting kids, but I think in the long run it doesn't make it better. In fact, it just makes it harder to deal with later on. And obviously, Zofia, you've talked a little bit about how you've experienced disability. How do you say that would affect you in the classroom setting? Because I'm curious as well.
Well, first was the issue of getting diagnosed. one of the things I have is ADHD. So in women, it tends to be severely underdiagnosed. And then in some minority groups, it's not viewed as like a problem that it's not viewed as like something that's wrong, but rather like a behavioral issue. And like then you get into issues of like school to prison pipeline, like et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the first hurdle was getting diagnosed, and then I got my 504 plan. And then I don't know, I'm pretty open about my disabilities or whatever. Like I'm not ashamed. Like if someone wants to, like, I don't care. But like one of the accommodations I get is like extra time on tests, and people would be like, "You're so lucky that you get extra time on tests for no reason." And then I take ADHD medication, and people were like, "You're so lucky that you get ADHD medication and you can take it and you can just focus anytime you want." And I'm like, "It's not a recreational drug to me. Like it's like a therapeutic device."
Yeah.
I really get that. I also experienced that with my accommodations of having people be like, "You're really lucky to have those accommodations." Like these are accommodations that help me exist like you do. That help me exist as like a person that has the same like access to like things that like you already get to deal with it as a person who doesn't face any disability. Like I also was a person that got, extra time on tests, or I had the issue to be able to retake tests if I had blood sugar issues, and leaving classrooms with blood sugar issues, or being able to go to the nurse's office, or leave to like, we're eating food in class. And I would, I remember like, I would like pull a juice box out, like to like, because that's what to me, that's like, I always make jokes that I never understood how people could drink juice boxes for fun, because for me, like in my brain, I've coded them as like life juice because I drink them when I have low blood sugar. And so like I would drink it in the class, and people would be like, "Oh my gosh, you're so lucky that you get to have food in class." And I'm like, I drink this so I don't die. Like it's not really like a, ooh, so fun, like snacks in class. Like I think people expect that, like there's also that presumption that you're like somehow exploiting the system, or that you're like exploiting your accommodations, as if your disability doesn't make life harder enough as it is. I've definitely experienced that, of people being like, you don't really need that, do you? Because they don't understand like how it impacts your life, and there's that like misunderstanding. So people are like, they see you as like a very like, I think because both of us, I assume, have pretty like what I always refer to as like invisible disabilities. Of they're not super apparent if you look at us, and so you don't exist in the mindset of what people assume is what disabled looks like, because there is, with everything, the idea of like the assumptions of what it looks like to be disabled, or what it appears like to be disabled. The same as you said with like difficulties getting diagnosed. Like a lot of times, AFAB people, which stands for assigned female at birth, have a hard time getting diagnosed with any sort of like neurological issues, like any sort of like neurodivergencies, like autism or ADHD, just because it's the way we code it tends to be male, and like people experience things differently. So yeah, it's interesting to see how all of that affects how people perceive you, and how people treat your existence and your accommodations.
You mentioned kind of this basically stigma, right? There's people see you in what you felt like, um, and they think that you're exploiting the system, and that belief on its own has some sort of impact on policy and resources they're able to receive, and maybe the funds that a university, not university, but like a school administrator might give towards the disability resources. They may think, oh, we don't want to give too much, we don't want to allow them to exploit the system. Zofia, maybe in your experience, how do you, because you're working in this world, have you seen that at all? Have you experienced that?
Well, like I work at a disability rights organization, so I wouldn't say that anything happens in the workplace as far as stigma. I feel like change and more accessibility and more resources has to come before ending stigma. I don't know. Like, yeah, there definitely is stigma towards people with disabilities, but like the main push is to get like resources for people with disabilities so that they can like live their lives. And then like once we make things accessible, like, and provide educational resources on like what disability is, then the stigma not goes like will be, reduced or mitigated. There definitely is a push to like reduce stigma in like language and the way we talk about people with disabilities, because like words are powerful and like carry connotations. Like the R slur, like we don't use that anymore because it's like offensive. At my organization, we use the default is person first language. So instead of disabled person, you say person with disabilities. Um, so you make sure that like a person's like personhood is their defining factor and not the fact that they have a disability. Um, for me, either is fine. And some people like, well, they prefer the label of just disabled person. I just say like use the language that people are comfortable with. But yeah, I think the main push that I've seen, especially in the workplace, has a lot to do with like language and the way we talk about people with disabilities. Like we don't use like the mentally ill. It's like people with mental health conditions, like not like the R slur. It's people with intellectual disabilities, like stuff like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. You mentioned that some of the process of removing stigma around disabilities comes as a result of having more resources and access to better resources. So I know Natalia and I went to a pretty big public high school in Sacramento, where we're from, and I know mental health resources were a bit iffy at times. I think there were a lot of students who felt like they couldn't rely on mental health resources at our school. I know we didn't even have a just regular nurse for a long period of time at our high school. So I know, at least in Natalia's my experience, some of these resources can be lacking at our schools. You're more tapped into this work. What would you say the general consensus is around K through 12 disability resources, and in your experience, what does that really look like?
Well, it's overall, I would say it's not great, especially when we talk about mental health resources. I mean, there definitely is this thing that like there are very specific laws like governing how people with disabilities are accommodated and should be accommodated. And there are like where I work, I'm on the non-legal side of things, but like a big part of what we do, it's like legal resources for people with disabilities who have had their rights violated. Um, but like obviously the goal is not to have your rights violated and have to, go through the court system to ameliorate it. The goal is to like just get the resources. Um, that's something that we were trying to do with SB 224, which was the bill to mandate education about mental health in public schools. Um, just because of politics, the way the bill started out and the version that got passed are very different. And there's a lot of, because, teachers don't want to have more things that they have to teach because they're severely underpaid and under-resourced. But even bills that like, or programs that provide like free mental health resources, like people from the community who come in and provide mental health resources at a school, like they literally just need a classroom to like set up their stuff. Like even those are widely opposed. But yeah, I don't know anyone who's had like a positive experience with like mental health resources at the school. Like the consensus is usually they're pretty bad.
So I want to talk about the legislation real quick. I'm all too familiar with the political process and how uh, this is the saying, usually the sausage gets made, because you tend to come out with a pretty simple, this is what we're going to do, and then everybody wants to attack in their little thingies, and then by the end, there's a lot of different pieces of meat in there. Where did it start and where did it end up? You mentioned that it ended up differently. Then would you mind explaining that to us?
Yeah, so where we started, the original text of the bill was mental health education in K through 12 schools. So the goal originally in the bill was to have mental health education at least once in elementary school, so like K through 6, once in middle school, 7th or 8th grade, and then once in high school, which would be like 9th through 12th grades. Because of substantial opposition from the big teachers union, and I get where they were coming from about like teachers already having too much to teach already, but like at the same time, like this is something that needed to happen a long time ago. So it got amended to mental health education only in schools that have an existing health curriculum. So there's a couple problems with that. Mostly that schools who have a health class already touch on mental health in some way. But also, like when you're in like kindergarten or, 4th grade, you don't have class periods. Like there's no health class. And I would say the vast majority of health classes are offered at the high school level in like 9th grade. So technically applying to K through 12 schools, it's basically once in high school in health classes that probably already taught mental health anyway. But the California Department of Education, once the bill formally gets implemented in January, they're working on stuff. Like after, this implementation process, there's like a chance to go further and mandate it in all schools, but that's a couple years from now. So for me, it was a little disappointing because I worked really closely on the bill, and I spoke in front of the Senate Health Committee and the Assembly Education Committee, and you like tell them how much it means to you and how like you wish you had these resources, and they're like, no.
That is well. I just want to say that A, thank you for your advocacy, and B, just because the war wasn't won in this one battle, this is a step forward. Even though that's not as satisfying, it means that in the next ask, in the next budget year, in the next legislative cycle, that you could once again ask for it to be implemented in the way that you want it to be. And the process is sometimes slow, but it does not mean that this opportunity is gone in the future.
Yeah. It was a little bit frustrating because they had tried to pass the same bill a couple years ago, and it got canned. So the progress is slow but very incremental. And Governor Newsom in this budget year, he has allocated a lot of resources towards mental health, like the Children and Youth like Behavioral Health Initiative and stuff. So hopefully with the inclusion of those resources, there will be more mental health resources in schools. Despite what happened with this bill, like obviously I'm happy it got passed, but I don't know. Because it was my first experience like working so in depth in the process, it was so disheartening. But I'm excited to see where it goes in the future.
I'm glad to hear that. Natalia, I'm curious how this bill, now that it's passed, and I'd love to hear if you're able to distinguish between the original idea versus the finalized product. How might this have changed your experience?
I don't know that much about like the political scope of disability. Unfortunately, I've not been that experienced with it. I know that having resources allocated in school to disabilities is always really important, because I know that when I was going to high school, we had a nurse that was there once every 2 weeks, I think, and I was asked while there by the nurse, because I was like one of their few students that had a disability that had experienced it for so long. I was asked on advice for how to train teachers and things like that. So obviously, like the idea of like, it would have been better in the first place of like not waiting to have a student that has a disability to inform teachers on how to deal with disability or teaching students, because as a student at a school I was also a very, very big school, so obviously I was not one of the only students there that had a disability, that I was being asked of like, oh, do you think that the teacher should have training on glucagon training, which is if I or any other diabetic student were to have passed out from low blood sugar, glucagon is an injection that you can give to raise blood sugar, and without it, it's very deadly to not have glucagon. And I was informed that very few teachers at the school had any glucagon training or any like administration training and things like that. And so the nurse asked me if that was something I wanted to be willing to like advocate for. Like I thought that it was important that teachers learn that, and the same goes for like other ideas of how to sort of treat disability, which is a lot of stress to put on. I was like 16 at the time. I was like, I don't know that much. I only know my personal experience, and it honestly seems kind of ill planned to address it after you already have students at a school that are just struggling with disability, instead of having a plan in place to protect students. So the idea that the fact that there's laws being implemented to help, educate teachers and students on how to address disability and mental illness is really important, because it shouldn't be on students or people that have disabilities to inform and educate people, because it's already difficult enough to deal with it. That's not really your job to be a teacher as well.
Yeah, and it's hard to strike that balance, right? And I think in an ideal world, at least I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that a teacher would be able to identify it right before even assuming that the student has access to healthcare, would be able to access a doctor who's able to accurately kind of diagnose whatever challenges student might be facing. Instead of teachers who don't know how to handle it, like they should be able to identify it in a classroom and be able to get resources for those students.
One of the big criticisms of SB 224 when it was going through the legislative process was that it would put too much liability on teachers, because teachers don't have training on like mental health and how to identify it and stuff. And the inclusion of a class, if it were spread out like throughout class periods and not in a health class, then teachers would have to get a bunch of training on like mental health and how to identify signs. But I think that's like a bigger issue, that teachers already don't have training on mental illness and they're like psychiatric conditions and how to identify them in the students that they teach. And I think a teacher without training has the ability to do so much harm. Like if a student comes to them saying that that they're dealing with depression or anxiety, and the teacher says, oh, you're strong, you can get over it, like instead of like a referral to actual services or a school psychologist or any sort of like effective means of dealing with mental health conditions. So I do think that teachers do have a lot on their plates already, but I don't think the solution is just throwing these necessary things by the wayside. Probably paying and appreciating teachers more is the solution if we expect them to do all this training, which I think could happen. Like I definitely think teachers deserve to be paid more regardless.
I'm curious about moving, I guess, away from the K through 12 conversation. Obviously, as we've been talking about, there's a lot to be discussed when it comes to where the responsibility should lie in terms of disability training. And Natalia, like you brought up, being asked to give input on your teachers and the knowledge they should have. And then Zofia, the points you brought up about putting too much weight on teachers. Hopefully legislation moving forward. I know, Zofia, you said it's can be kind of incremental. Hopefully this is something that can be addressed as we continue to develop legislation and hopefully pass it. But I'm curious, a lot of this conversation has been centered around K through 12 experiences. I guess starting with Natalia, I know both of you are in college now. Zofia, you're at Fresno Community College looking to transfer to a UC. Good luck with your apps, by the way. Natalia, you're in your first quarter at UCSD. So I guess starting with you, Natalia, what's it been like to go through the process of kind of entering adulthood, starting a new stage of life with a disability, and particularly like moving out and attending a new institution. I mean, I'm sure there've been, not to speak for you, but I guess there's just been a lot of changes that have been happening in regards to the circumstances and the responsibilities that you have. So can you talk a little bit about that?
For me personally, like a big issue that I faced was I had to change insurances just because I grew up in Northern California, and I'm now going to school in SoCal. So obviously my insurance doesn't cover, the the doctors that we have down here are not the same as up north, and so I had to transfer to, UC health insurance and all of that, of like the struggle to try to find an endocrinologist and getting referrals and having to meet my doctor here and all of that stuff. And I was lucky that the doctor, my primary care physician that I got to meet with, within the first like month I was at school, was very informed on diabetes and immediately put in a referral for me when she saw that I was a diabetic, which was very nice of her. There is still a lot of difficulty of like picking what doctors you want. Like I still have to go through all the process of going through the insurance to find out like how to get to my endocrinologist and things like that. And I know that filing for disabilities was a really kind of strange process. I mean, I was sort of more used to the 504 plan, which was developed when I was pretty young, when my parents were sort of in charge of it, and so it was developed by my doctors, and so it was kind of like every year my doctor would sign off on it. And the transition to college, I was talking to disability offices for like a few hours. You have to go through the process of telling them like what your disability is and how it affects you, and you have to write a whole thing, and you have to like address what disability accommodations you think you need. You have to, if you have a 504 plan, it helps a lot, or any form of previous disability accommodations. And then you have to like call to get them implemented, and also the same goes for housing. There's a different application for both housing and both academic accommodations if you live on the dorms. And so that was really strange because I had to I remember I was traveling and I had to fill out all these documents to just I had to get my endocrinologist to sign off on something. I had to, get all of my old and any of my old records to the school. And it was kind of like I realized I was really lucky that I was in a position where I had, parents helping me for a really long time, like with access to like insurance and medical documents and going to health appointments. And I had really great doctors, which was really great. And I realized it's so difficult for students out there that have disabilities that don't have a good support system and don't have doctors that are willing to basically write things for them, emails, things like that. And so that weird transfer to also like leaving behind all of my old doctors was kind of strange. I think it was weird because you're suddenly sort of pushed out in the world on your own, so you're sort of in charge of everything. And it's weird because for so long, especially throughout high school and prior to that, I was so used to having the same doctors and having a similar school environment, and so teachers sort of knew to an extent. And now it's very different because college is very different from high school in a lot of ways. It's so much bigger, so it's a lot harder to keep track of all of the students, and you have less of a personal relationship with your faculty, so it's less easy to have a conversation about getting your needs recognized. So,
Natalia, based on your experience, do you think it would be helpful? Let me roll it back a little bit. So there's something actually being implemented now in the coming years. I think it's actually starting next year. California's longitudinal data system, which is basically a massive data system that amasses. It's longitudinal, and so as soon as you enter the education system, the state's going to keep all your record in one place, and students will be able to use their records and share it, and there's a lot that kind of comes to it. But what's not included in this data is, give me a second, gotta refresh. What's not included in this data is qualitative data, basically this kind of stuff, right? What have you experienced? What support might you need? What they will be able to see is this student has a disability. They wouldn't be able to know what, they wouldn't be able to see necessarily the details of how to best support you. You think it would be helpful if a data system like this included further details, maybe from your previous counselors, I'd be able to leave notes, and then that information always be to college? Do you think that would kind of help alleviate some of the challenges that come out of starting a new life like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that It's just a fine line to walk on like the legal issues of trying to protect students' rights and students' privacies of medical issues, which is obviously very evident with HIPAA laws and things like that. But I think that like as long as students write off on obviously having that information being given to teachers and to faculty and anyone they're part of the top state school system, of having that just easily accessible for everyone who's involved, it makes it a lot easier to transition between classes because I'm on the quarter system here, which means that like every 10 weeks I'm having new teachers and new classes, which makes it kind of difficult to really get situated with, like I used to have like, year-long teachers and stuff, getting situated with how my disability accommodations will be implemented. So the idea of having it being able to store it in one direct area would be very helpful because obviously I'm not like embarrassed about my disability. I'm obviously very upfront about it, and so it makes it a lot easier if teachers and faculty have a very like straightforward place and other doctors and everything have a very straightforward place to go and look for it.
Definitely. I think, Natalia, as you brought up, you have had a lot of support from family and just like the situation that you were in. That isn't necessarily true for all people and particularly students with disabilities who have had disabilities from a young age. I guess transitioning over to you, Zofia, similarly, what has your experience been, I guess, moving into this new life stage, into adulthood, into being a college student, but also have you noticed any challenges when it comes to equity within the resources that you're trying to access or the accommodations you're trying to get? And I guess what work is there currently happening right now about how to make disability resources equitable?
So like the transition period from like childhood into adulthood, like that's my like area of expertise, like as a member of the demographic. It's like transitional age youth or TAY. I might use the terms interchangeably. But yeah, so basically like once you turn 18, like a lot of things are just like your responsibility. Like for schools, like there's FERPA, so your parents can't look at your grades or like make educational decisions for you or view your educational progress. For healthcare, like I had to make a dentist appointment for myself the other day. I was in shambles. That was too much for me to handle. So yeah, and the problem with transitional age youth is that there are a lot of services for adults with disabilities and children with disabilities, but not necessarily for like young adults in that transition period, which is a very critical time because, like it sets you up for success for like basically your entire life. So yeah, recently there has been a push to expand resources for transitional age youth and focus specifically on transitional age youth advocacy. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to expand resources for that particular demographic. There are I think any facet of something like disability, there's going to be equity issues along like race lines, class lines, gender lines. But I think you try to fix those as much as you can by expanding culturally competent resources, free and low cost resources, and resources that cater to specific identities so people can feel included and heard in their care. Yeah, for education, I know a lot of transitional age youth struggle with the transition to education because, when you have a 504, your parents and teachers are the ones who kind of manage that for you. For an IEP, the transition planning is included, but like for 504s, like once you, like there's no plan for you to, turn 18 and have to carry all of that by yourself. So yeah, it's difficult. When I first, my first like semester at community college, I had difficulty because all of my accommodations were for in-person learning.
Mm.
So with the transition to online asynchronous learning, I really struggled. That was also the time when I was like moving out to live on my own and dealing with all these other life changes in the midst of a pandemic. So I was like, I can't, this semester, I can't do it. So I went and I was like, hey, I have a disability. All of these other factors. I need like the emergency withdrawal or excused withdrawal, the one that doesn't negatively impact your records. So I got them for all my classes that semester. I was like, okay, like, great. And then I got an email that they revoked my financial aid. I was so upset. Like, and community college, if it was a more expensive institution that I was unable to pay for by myself, it would have been more troubling. But like it's like $600 a semester, which I can deal with. But like getting back on the financial aid is like such a process. Like so I so after that I was like, oh my God. But yeah, I think like just like things like that, like I feel like the transition to online learning was hard for like a lot of people with disabilities, especially those who are blind or deaf. Like there's a lot of issues like transitioning, like closed captioning or like text to speech in online formats. And a lot of people didn't think about that because obviously it was a hasty transition, but that doesn't mean that there's an excuse for leaving so many people behind.
When it comes to be growing up with diabetes and now being at the point where you're an adult with diabetes, kind of not to completely go back to what you just said about like having to call your dentist. I have to call my insurance provider and change a bunch of info, and I am like so stressed about that. I guess like with the insurance conversation, back to you, Natalia, about diabetes, that's a huge conversation that we're seeing right now when it comes to healthcare for people with diabetes. And I guess I'm curious about your experiences and your feelings about reaching adulthood and like your thoughts about having to figure out insurance once you reach a certain age because insulin is so unaffordable for those without healthcare.
Yeah, so speaking a little bit about like right now, I can really relate to what you were saying, Zofia, because I'm my first semester of college and I have so much going on with my health insurance and health providers right now of changing all of that. It's such a stressful time, and on top of that, I have to get a whole bunch of medical supplies renewed, and so my parents have been on me so much for the past like weeks on end. I had to call my doctor like 4 different times, things like that, like have appointments, everything. And I hated it. It was the worst time because I was like doing like midterms and I was getting calls from my parents being like, "You need a new insulin pump. Like, have you called people? Like all of this stuff." And I was like, "Yeah, one sec, I'm working on it. There's so much going on right now." Of trying to figure that out, of like having all of the normal responsibilities of adulthood and college and all of that, while you also have to deal with everything that comes with your chronic illness or your disability and everything. And so for me personally, like that was such a strange, hard transition, is having to do all of that work of getting like a new insulin pump and talking to doctors and making sure I was having all my medical supplies and things getting shipped here and changing all of that information. Meanwhile, like still balancing school was so stressful. And then I constantly have to be thinking ahead because I'm on my parents' insurance until I believe I'm 25. I think that is how it is for most people. And I'm really lucky to have insurance that covers a vast majority of my medical costs. But a really big thing for me is I am aware of how horribly expensive insulin is in this country. And it is one of the biggest things that it like to this day, like it makes me like, it boils my blood of how expensive it is. Because if you know the history of insulin was discovered by scientists at the University of Toronto in Canada, and they sold the patent for $1 each because of how important they thought this discovery was. That they knew it was going to save so many lives. And right now, like a vial of insulin that costs around $5 to manufacture can be between like $300 to like even $600, which is insane if you don't have insurance for a vial of insulin. That I go through about a vial of insulin like every like week and a half or so. So if you consider how expensive that is without insurance, it is it is life-threateningly expensive. And I was doing some research for a senior project in high school about it, and like I think I forget the exact amount of diabetics that have admitted to insulin rationing in order to meet the amount of be able to afford it, because it is so expensive that they quite literally cannot afford life-saving medicine, this medicine that keeps you alive. It is one of the most expensive liquids in the world, and it is one that is fairly easy to manufacture.
It kind of comes down almost to like a decision between rent, food, or insulin for a lot of people, which is ridiculous.
No one should be dying of diabetes. Like, no one should be dying of not having access to insulin. And it is still something that so many, like, there's a lot of young people that don't have access to health insurance that are quite literally dying from type 1 diabetes, which is an easily not curable, because there is no cure for it, but treatable illness through insulin management and giving insulin and stuff. But because of how expensive it is so unaffordable. And it's so heartbreaking to see the amount of people that have to starve themselves and not eat food and things like that because they can't afford the insulin to let them die, like basically process that sugar intake. And I'm constantly like trying to figure out what I'm going to do. Of like, by the age of 25, I have to have some form of insurance that is not my parents, and how am I going to get that? Like, if I'm in grad school, whatnot. And like, I've been thinking about this for a very long time, because even though I'm 18 right now, 7 years away is not that long of a time if you think about it, especially when you think of like how detrimental it would be if I don't have health insurance because of how expensive insulin is. And so, especially if you're like 25, most people don't have very steady jobs. Sometimes they don't have access to insurance companies, things like that. And if you're in grad school, if you're still studying in school, that it makes it very, very difficult. And it's like hard to think about what's going to happen, and that's still something that I'm very anxious about. And it's really annoying if you, especially when you like look at other countries that have universal healthcare. Like Eleanor and I are both Swedish. My mom is from Sweden, and Sweden is a place that has universal healthcare. And that was, I always like talk about, like I always joke that that's my backup option if I'm 25 and I don't have health insurance. I'm just gonna pull out that Swedish citizenship and go to a place, because I like it will literally come down to me being like, I either will have to have health insurance in the US through some sort of job or some sort of company because of how unaffordable insulin is, or I'm going to have to move to a different country because that is how literally expensive my disability is. So
I just first appreciate you sharing your experience, and that is a real challenge that so many people across this country are facing, and it's kind of embarrassing that our government hasn't come up with a solution to solve it.
Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing your experience. There's one question here at PolicyWise that we tend to ask all of our guests at the end of our recording, and I'd love to hear your responses to this. What would your message be to young people and policy professionals who are listening to this conversation and looking to do something about it? What are something that people could do daily in order to support people with disabilities? What about folks who are looking more to get involved?
If you want to, I can go first. I'm not lit or as immersed within the policy realm. I'm just a person that has disabilities, so that is my experience.
Like, that's like valid. Like, I feel like people with disabilities are like the best people to inform the policy making process, because it's like you don't know what it's like until you have one, or if you were born with one. Like, it's impossible to like understand the experience. Not impossible to understand, but
No,
like
I agree with you on that.
hard.
Yeah, that is the biggest thing that I've had to learn, is that people just don't get it, and I think it's also a big thing for people that don't have disabilities or have loved ones with disabilities, that is one thing I could convey to those people, is that as much as you mean well to be like, I would trade places with you in an instant, or any of the things that people say in support or whatever, is that you'll never understand the experiences that you don't have. You can empathize to an extent, but understanding and support is the best you can do. But unfortunately, it's hard to understand what it's like to be disabled if you don't have the disability in question. And I guess I will transition that into my advice for any policy advising. Obviously, I think Zofia will probably be much more well versed in that sort of universe, so I will give my very layman terms of what I would do. I know personally that for me, it would be so much more helpful having universal health insurance if there's any way to start sort of like the idea of trying to break down monopolies on in big pharma on medications, because it is such a life-threatening thing for so many people. The idea that we have a country that exists in which you can capitalize off of people's illnesses is just so disheartening and horrible, especially when we're, like insulin in the US is like $300 versus, surrounded by by Canada on one side and Mexico on the other, where it's $30. It's really just awful. The idea that politicians will oftentimes support the idea of like the economic betterment, or the idea of supporting lobbyists or supporting companies over human lives, the idea of profit over people being a huge thing instead of people over profit. And so the idea of like, if you ever in a position to break down big pharma monopolies, of changing the requirements for monopolies, because I know that a huge thing for having your patent on insulin, at least insulin, for example, and for big pharma companies, is that you don't even have to actually make any progressive changes to the medication, but if you change it slightly, you can renew your patent on it, because patents, I think, only last about 5 years. So every 5 years, a lot of insulin companies will change the insulin just slightly, and you don't have to prove that it works better. You just have to prove it works just the same, and then you can get your patent renewed, which is really sad, especially considering that it's what allows big pharma companies to charge $300 for a vial of insulin that costs $5 to make. And so that extends for all health insurance. The idea of like, if you're in a position of policy, your place should be putting people over profit, of trying to take down whatever big monopolies form on whatever medications, of make sure price gouging doesn't exist for medications, and supporting people. And the idea of if there's a way that you can implement any form of healthcare, it is the best steps that we have to make, even if it's not universal healthcare right off the gate. We talked a little bit about the idea of incremental steps, of just making it so it's easier for people to access the medications that they need.
What about you, Zofia? What's your call to action?
I would say first, just try to be maybe mindful of just how inaccessible the world is for people with disabilities. Like, anytime you walk up the stairs, like, look if there's a ramp. Like, would a person in a wheelchair be able to access the same facilities that you're able to access? Or if you're watching a video and there's no captions, like, how would a deaf person be able to understand like what you're saying, or like and just have the same enjoyment like from the video as you are? And I think that also transcends into like little things we can do to make the world more accessible, like captions on videos. On Instagram, you can add like image descriptions of like your photos, and you can do that on a lot of social media sites. So if people aren't able to see, they will be able to like know what the content of the photo is. And there are like a bunch of little things for like people who might have like physical disabilities that impair movement, or like invisible disabilities, like both physical or psychiatric, or whatever. I think it's like a joint effort to make the world more accessible, and it can't just be like disabled people advocating for, or it can't just be people with disabilities advocating for ramps as an inclusion to stairs, or like those little bumpy things on the sidewalks that allow like blind people with canes to like be able to like know where the curb is, or where the crosswalk is. I don't know the specific name, but like the world we have built is one that is inherently inaccessible. And I'm not sure the exact theory. It's like the ability theory of disability is that like if everyone else could fly and you can't, and if everything was like up in buildings in the sky, and like there's no way for you to get up there because you can't fly. Like, you would be, it would be considered like a disability because you couldn't do the same things that everyone else did. But if there was an elevator or a set of stairs so you could walk up or go up to where everyone else is, like, it wouldn't be like a disability because you could get to the same place that everyone else is. Like disability as a concept is like, the world has made it hard to exist as a person with disabilities, like, instead of like something being inherently like, as opposed to a person being like inherently unable to do something. Like, the world is inaccessible. Like, did that make sense? Sorry.
That totally made sense. No, I was just thinking like, wow, I've never thought of it in that framing before, and I feel like that's just definitely something for me to think about, and I will be thinking about that after we finish recording. But I just want to say thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you talking about your lived experiences and your advocacy and giving us your input about where we should be headed. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. It was really great to meet you, Zofia, and you as well, Michael. Eleanor, I do know you. Surprise, surprise. Great seeing you again, Eleanor.
Yeah, so funny.
I guess as like a funny little closeout, if anyone cares. I don't know if people care. But as a part of the sibling dynamic type thing, I got diagnosed 11 years ago and I was 7 years old. And it is funny how a sibling can sometimes be the most grounding and most like calming, like stress alleviating person in the whole process just by being mean. Because what's normal is I was in the hospital for I think 5 days. Anyways, I was in the ICU when I first got diagnosed, and I remember I didn't see my sister for like the first two and a half days, something like that. And so the first time I saw her, I think my mom and my dad were like, "Your sister's coming in, blah blah blah. You get to see her for the first time." And I was like, "Great, so exciting!" And I remember taking this big old IV down the hallway that was bigger than me, and I had gotten in trouble so many times riding that thing down the hallway like a skateboard. But I remember dragging this IV with me, and I was like in my pajamas, and I'd been like in the hospital for 2.5 days and all that stuff. And I took it with me, and I greeted my sister at this elevator, and it was the first time I'd see her, and I had been in the hospital. And instead of being like, "Oh my God, it's so great to see you," the first thing she says to me, she gives me this up and down look, and she goes, "You look terrible." This is
keeping it real.
And it was the most, I like still think of it as the most stress alleviating thing of the whole process, is just because it was the most normal thing. Everybody had been like walking in eggshells and been like, they're like, "Oh my God, been diagnosed with a chronic illness, the whole issue, everything." And I just went to her and she was like, "You look horrible." And I was like, "Everything's normal. It's fine."
It's the sibling way. It's a sibling way. I also remember I walked in and you had like your terrible hospital food, and I was like, "Can I have your peas?" Because I love peas.
Yeah,
so
anyway, meal in the hospital, and Eleanor would eat all of them. Yes,
I ate all of the peas. I love peas. I'm obsessed with them. Anyway, unrelated. Thank you again for joining us on this podcast.
This was PolicyWise, an intergenerational podcast by Youth Leadership Institute focused on bringing young people into the policy conversation. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at PolicyWisePod. If you have any questions or suggestions for discussion topics, please email us at policywise@yli.org, and stay tuned for upcoming episodes.